Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair at 221B, Baker Street, the quiet crackle of the fire, the only sound filling the room. His sharp eyes, usually so focused and calculating, were now distant, unfocused as they rested on the half-finished letter in front of him. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the hearth, the familiar scent of tobacco filling the air, yet Holmes was aware of none of it. His mind was elsewhere, caught in the grip of something that had been haunting him for years. It was a feeling he had not experienced often: fear. Dr. John Watson, his trusted companion and friend, observed from across the room, his face etched with concern. Watson had known Holmes for many years, had seen him face danger with unshaken resolve, had watched him solve mysteries that baffled even the brightest minds. But this was different. Holmes had always prided himself on solving the unsolvable, on piecing together the most complex puzzles with logic and deduction. But there was one case, one mystery, that had eluded him, and Watson knew that it was this very mystery that now troubled his friend. "Holmes," Watson finally said, his voice gentle, but with an underlying note of worry, "you've been staring at that letter for over an hour. What's troubling you?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He simply picked up the letter, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn paper. It was a letter he had received years ago, one he had carefully kept hidden from Watson and everyone else. It had come to him during a period in his life when he had been investigating a series of disappearances, a case that had, at the time, seemed like just another in a long line of perplexing puzzles. But this case was different. The letter, when it had arrived, had been a warning, one that Holmes had ignored at first, convinced that it was just another trick. But the longer he had sat with it, the more he realized that it was a warning about something he had always feared, a case he could never solve, something that lay just beyond the reach of even his formidable intellect. The letter had been brief, almost cryptic. Its message had been simple, but it carried with it a weight that Holmes could not shake. "You cannot solve this one, Holmes. This is not a case for your mind. You will fail, just as you did before." Holmes had kept the letter hidden away for all these years, unwilling to confront the truth of what it meant. It was a case that had come back to haunt him, one that he had failed to solve all those years ago. A woman had vanished, seemingly without a trace, and despite his best efforts, Holmes had never been able to uncover what happened to her. There had been no ransom note, no sign of foul play, nothing but a hole in the middle of the puzzle. And now, this letter, this reminder, had forced him to confront the one case that had haunted him for years. The woman in question was Eleanor Rhodes, a figure from Holmes' past, a case that had never been properly closed. Eleanor had been a colleague, a fellow investigator, and they had worked together on several cases before her disappearance. But one day, without warning, she had simply vanished. Holmes had tried to solve the case, had followed every lead, questioned every witness, and yet, despite all his brilliance, he had found nothing. The police had given up. Eleanor's family had moved on, but Holmes couldn't. He had failed, and that failure was a wound that never fully healed. Watson, watching his friend carefully, sensed the internal struggle that was playing out before him. Holmes was not the type to shy away from difficult cases. But this one was different. This one was personal. And Watson could see that the pain of it, the weight of that unresolved mystery, had taken a toll on Holmes, more than any of his past cases had ever done. Holmes had always been in control, always one step ahead of his adversaries, but now he was trapped in a case that had slipped through his fingers. "I couldn't save her, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I failed, and that is a failure that I cannot bear. I thought I could solve anything, but this case has broken me." Watson stood up, moving closer to Holmes, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Holmes, you're not perfect. No one is. You've solved more cases than anyone could ever dream of. But this one, it got away from you. We all have things we can't solve. Even you." Holmes shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and self-doubt. "It's not just that, Watson. It's the way she disappeared. The way no one saw anything. No one heard anything. It was as if she had never existed at all. But I know she did. I know she was real. And yet there's nothing. Not a trace. Not a clue." The words hung heavy in the air, the silence stretching between them. Holmes stood up, his hands clenched at his sides, pacing the room in agitation. Watson watched him, understanding that this was something deeper than just a case. This was about the very core of Holmes' identity, his need to be in control, his need to solve the unsolvable. In this case, this mystery had shaken him to the core. Watson spoke again, more firmly this time. "Holmes, we can't change the past. We can only move forward. If you're truly going to solve this case, you need to let go of the fear that you'll fail again. The fear of failure is what holds you back. You need to face it, Holmes. You need to face the truth that you can't control everything." Holmes stopped pacing, turning to face Watson. His eyes were sharp, as if the words had cut through the fog in his mind. For the first time in years, Holmes felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or maybe just a recognition of a truth he had been avoiding. "You're right, Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady now, filled with resolve. "I have to face it. I can't let this mystery control me any longer. It's time to confront it head-on. Eleanor Rhodes' disappearance. It ends now." With that, Holmes reached for his coat and hat, his resolve firming. Watson followed suit, moving to his side. They were going back to the place where it all began. The answers, Holmes was certain, lay there, hidden beneath the layers of time and fear. As they walked out of 221B, Baker Street, and into the night, Holmes felt the weight of the past lift, if only slightly. The journey ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with more questions than answers, more uncertainty than certainty. But Holmes knew one thing for sure. He was no longer running from the mystery. He was going to face it, no matter the cost. And this time he would solve it,